They laughed when Karoline Leavitt stepped onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage. A young press secretary they thought was out of her depth. She stood calm, her necklace glinting, while the host twisted her words for laughs. No one knew she carried a senator's legacy in her journal. Why would someone so underestimated dare to face a national spotlight? Before we dive into today's story, if you find this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. You're also welcome to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Every piece of feedback is truly valuable in helping Crossfire Justice improve. Thank you so much for always being with us. And now, let's jump into this thrilling and unexpected story together. The Sunset Stage in Los Angeles glowed under a canopy of harsh lights, the air thick with the buzz of a live audience. Karoline Leavitt, barely 27, stepped onto the polished floor of Jimmy Kimmel Live, her heels clicking softly. She was the youngest White House press secretary in history, a title that felt like both a badge and a burden. The crowd offered a polite clap, but their eyes scanned her, some curious, others skeptical. She smoothed her navy blazer, her fingers brushing a small gold cross necklace, a gift from her late mentor. It grounded her, a quiet anchor in the storm she sensed brewing. Jimmy Kimmel, perched behind his desk, flashed a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "So, Karoline," he began, his voice slick with amusement. "You're here to defend him." The word landed like a dart, and the audience laughed, a few jeering. He meant Trump, of course, and the room knew it. Karoline's smile tightened, but she nodded, her posture steady. She'd faced rooms like this before, people who saw her youth, her small-town roots, and assumed she was out of her depth. Jimmy leaned forward, his tone sharpening as he rattled off a list of Trump's old quotes. Each one cherry-picked to paint her as naive, a pawn in a game too big for her. "You really believe in all this?" he pressed, eyebrows raised, inviting the crowd to join his disbelief. Laughter rolled through the studio, and a stagehand off-camera snickered, loud enough for her to hear. Her heart raced, a familiar heat creeping up her neck. She wasn't new to being underestimated. High school debates, college panels, even her first press briefings had taught her that. But this stage, with its glaring lights and live feed to millions, felt different. It was a trap, and she was the target. She adjusted her necklace, the cool metal calming her pulse. "I'm here to talk about my work," she said evenly, her voice clear but soft. The audience quieted, expecting more, but Jimmy wasn't done. He flipped to another quote, this one harsher, and read it with a smirk. "Care to explain that one?" The crowd erupted again, some clapping, others shouting barbs. Karoline's fingers tightened around the armrest, but her face stayed composed, her eyes locked on Jimmy's. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, from the front row to the control booth. A young intern, standing in the wings with a coffee tray, glanced at her, then away. Was it pity, curiosity? Karoline couldn't tell. The segment break loomed, and Jimmy delivered his parting shot. "Good luck explaining that one." "Karoline." The audience roared, the sound swallowing her. As the stage lights dimmed for the commercial, Karoline exhaled, her breath shaky but controlled. She'd been here before, in smaller rooms with smaller stakes. But this wasn't just about her. It was about the people who'd believed in her, the ones who'd seen past her age and her quiet demeanor. Her hand drifted to her pocket, where a worn leather journal rested, its pages filled with notes from a man who'd taught her to stand firm. The audience's laughter lingered in her ears, and Jimmy's smirk burned in her mind. She wasn't here to play their game. She was here for something bigger. But as the crew signaled the break's end, her phone buzzed faintly against her thigh. A message. From someone watching. Who was it and what did they know? The green room backstage at the Sunset Stage smelled faintly of stale coffee and the hairspray, its dim lights casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Karoline Leavitt sat on a sagging couch, her navy blazer neatly folded beside her, her hands clasped around a small leather journal. Its edges were frayed, the brown cover softened by years of touch. She opened it to a page marked by a faded ribbon, her eyes tracing a handwritten note inked in careful, slanting script. Speak truth, even when they laugh. The words belonged to Reverend Hargrove, her mentor from a small New Hampshire town, a man who'd seen her spark when she was just a teenager debating in church halls. He'd passed 2 years ago, but his voice still steadied her, like a hand on her shoulder. Her fingers lingered on the page, the paper cool against her skin. She wasn't here to prove herself to Jimmy Kimmel or his audience. She was here for something deeper, something Hargrove had taught her to carry. Outside, the audience's laughter from the first segment still echoed, sharp and mocking, seeping through the thin walls. Karoline's chest tightened, not from fear but from the weight of being misjudged. She'd felt this before college professors dismissing her as too earnest, reporters sneering at her youth during briefings. At 27, she was used to eyes that sized her up and found her wanting. A producer's voice cut through her thoughts, low but clear from the hallway. She's too young for this. Kimmel's gonna eat her alive. The words stung. But Karoline didn't flinch. Her jaw tightened, and she pressed her thumb against the journal's spine, grounding herself. She'd learned long ago that reacting too fast gave people like that power. Silence, Hargrove had said, was sometimes the loudest answer. Across the room, a young intern named Maya stood near the door, balancing a tray of coffee cups. Her dark hair was pulled back, and her eyes flicked toward Karoline, curious but hesitant. She looked barely 20, her name tag slightly crooked. Karoline caught her glance and offered a small smile, the kind you give someone who might understand. Maya's lips twitched, almost returning the gesture, but she looked away, busying herself with the tray. Was she just shy? Or did she sense the tension in the air? Karoline's gaze drifted back to the journal. Tucked between its pages were more than Hargrove's words, names, dates, and a story no one in this glitzy studio expected. She'd carried it for years, not as a weapon, but as a shield. It was her truth, and it was heavier than anyone knew. The green room's TV flickered, showing the stage where Jimmy Kimmel's voice boomed through the speakers, promising more after the break. The audience cheered, their energy a stark contrast to the quiet of this room. Karoline closed the journal, her fingers brushing the gold cross necklace at her throat. She wasn't naive, despite what they thought. She'd walked into this studio knowing it was a battlefield, not a talk show. Every question, every laugh was a test, and she'd prepared for it. But preparation didn't dull the ache of being seen as less experienced, less credible, less worthy. Her phone, tucked in her pocket, stayed silent, but she felt its weight. Someone out there was watching, someone who knew her story. Hargrove had always said the truth finds its moment. Was this it? She stood, smoothing her skirt, and slipped the journal into her bag. Maya glanced up, her eyes lingering this time, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Karoline nodded at her, a quiet acknowledgement, and moved toward the door. The producer's muttering faded as she stepped into the hallway, the stage lights visible in the distance. Jimmy's voice grew louder, calling her back to the set. The laughter, the doubts, the eyes waiting to judge her, they were all there, ready to pounce. But so was she. The journal's weight in her bag felt like a promise. Whatever was in those pages, it wasn't just a story, it was her strength, and it was waiting for its moment. The stage lights at the Sunset Stage snapped back on, their glare harsh against the polished floor, as Karoline Leavitt returned to her seat. The audience's buzz filled the air, a mix of excitement and judgment, their eyes pinned on her like she was a specimen under glass. She adjusted her blazer, the gold cross necklace catching a glint of light, and forced a steady breath. Her heart still carried the sting of the first segment, Jimmy Kimmel's mocking tone, the crowd's laughter, the stagehand's snicker. But she'd walked back out here, chin up, because that's what Reverend Hargrove had taught her. You don't run from a fight you believe in. The leather journal in her bag, tucked backstage, felt like a quiet ally, its pages holding truth she wasn't ready to share. Not yet. The crowd settled, and Jimmy leaned forward, his smile sharp, like a man who'd already won. He didn't waste time. Let's get to it. Karoline, he said, his voice smooth but laced with challenge. A screen behind him lit up, projecting a tweet attributed to her, a short, clipped defense of a controversial Trump policy on immigration. The words looked stark, almost foreign, stripped of the context she'd written them in. Care to explain this one, Jimmy asked, his smirk inviting the audience to join him. The crowd leaned in, some booing before she could speak, their murmurs rippling through the studio. Karoline's breath caught, a cold knot tightening in her chest. The tweet wasn't wrong, but it was distorted, pulled from a longer thread where she'd explained her reasoning, her call for compassion alongside security. She opened her mouth to clarify, but Jimmy cut her off, his hand raised like a teacher scolding a child. Hold on, he said. Let's talk about loyalty. You're 27. You really believe in all this? The question landed like a slap, and the audience erupted, some clapping, others jeering. A man in the front row, his face red under a baseball cap, shouted, "Go back to school!" The words hit harder than they should have, echoing the doubts she'd faced since her first day in Dushatsu. Karoline's hands trembled, but she pressed them against the armrest, steadying herself. She could feel the room closing in, the air thick with expectation. Jimmy piled on, his questions coming faster now about her age, her blind faith, her role as a mouthpiece for a man half the country despised. Each one was a jab, framed to paint her as naive, a small-town girl in over her head. She tried again to speak, to explain the tweet's context, but Jimmy's voice drowned her out, his grin widening as the crowd fed his momentum. The stage felt suffocating, the lights too hot, the laughter too loud. In the wings, Maya, the young intern, stood frozen, her coffee tray gripped tightly, and her face was tense, her eyes darting between Karoline and the stage. She'd seen this before, guests ambushed, reduced to punchlines, but something about Karoline's quiet resolve tugged at her. Maya shifted, her sneakers squeaking faintly. But no one noticed. Karoline did, though. She caught the intern's glance, a fleeting moment of connection in the chaos. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her she wasn't alone. She straightened, her voice cutting through Jimmy's next question. "I wrote that tweet to start a conversation," she said, her tone firm but calm. "If you'd let me finish, I'd explain why." The audience quieted, surprised by her steadiness to decide, but Jimmy leaned back, unfazed. "Oh, we've got time," he said, his sarcasm clear. "Go ahead, enlighten us." She started to speak, laying out the policy's intent, her words measured but clear. But halfway through, Jimmy interrupted again, pivoting to another quote, this one older, harsher. The crowd roared and Karoline's heart sank. This wasn't a conversation, it was a performance, and she was the prop. Her hands tightened on the armrest, her mind racing. She could walk off, but that would prove them right. She could shout, but that would make her the caricature they wanted. Hargrove's words echoed in her head. Speak truth, even when they laugh. She swallowed, her throat dry, and glanced at the audience. Some faces were hostile, others curious, a few unreadable. Maya, still in the wings, hadn't moved, her eyes locked on Karoline, as if willing her to keep going, just as Jimmy leaned back, triumphant, ready to deliver another jab. Karoline's phone buzzed in her pocket, a faint vibration unnoticed by the crowd, but it jolted her. A message. She didn't reach for it, couldn't. Not now, but its presence was a lifeline. Who was it? Someone watching. Someone who knew what she carried in that journal. The segment ended, the lights dimming for a break, but the tension hung heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Jimmy's smirk lingered as he promised more to come. Karoline's gaze stayed steady, her heart pounding. She wasn't done. Something was shifting, and she could feel it. The Sunset stage buzzed with restless energy as the commercial break ended, the audience settling back into their seats under the relentless glare of the studio lights. Karoline Leavitt sat upright, her hands folded in her lap, the gold cross necklace at her throat catching faint glimmers. The air felt heavier now, charged with the weight of the last segment's ambush, Jimmy Kimmel's relentless questions, the distorted tweet, the crowd's jeers. Her heart still thudded from the man's shout to go back to school, but she'd steadied herself, drawing on the quiet strength she'd learned from years of being underestimated. The leather journal, now retrieved from her bag backstage, rested on the chair beside her, its worn cover a silent promise. She wasn't here to be a punchline. She was here to honor a legacy, one that Jimmy and his audience couldn't begin to guess. Jimmy leaned forward, his grin sharp, sensing blood in the water. "All right, Karoline, let's cut to it," he said, his voice slick with confidence. "You're 27. What makes you think you can handle the White House?" The question was a blade, meant to slice through her credibility, and the audience laughed, the sound rolling over her like a wave. Some clapped, egging him on, while others leaned forward, curious despite themselves. Karoline's breath hitched, the sting of the laughter cutting deeper than she'd expected. She'd heard versions of this before, reporters doubting her experience, colleagues whispering about her age, but here, on this stage, with millions watching, it felt like a public trial. Her fingers brushed the journal, grounding her. She wasn't just a press secretary. She was something more. Something they didn't see. Her voice cut through the noise, calm but firm, like a river carving stone. "I was trained by someone who knew the truth about power," she said, her eyes locked on Jimmy's. The audience quieted, caught off guard by her steadiness. She reached for the journal, her movements deliberate, and opened it to a page marked by a faded photo. She held it up, just long enough for the camera to catch a younger Karoline, maybe 19, standing beside a man in a suit, both smiling in front of a New Hampshire courthouse. "This is my mentor, Senator Hargrove," she said, her voice steady but warm, like she was sharing a memory with a friend. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Senator Hargrove, a respected figure known for his integrity, had died years ago, but his name still carried weight, even in this cynical room. Faces shifted, some skeptical, others stunned. Jimmy's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly, leaning back with a scoff. "You expect us to believe you were his protégé," he said, his tone dripping with disbelief, inviting the audience to join him. A few laughed, but the sound was thinner now, less certain. Karoline didn't flinch. She flipped to another page in the journal, her fingers steady, and read aloud, "Power isn't in the loudest voice, but in the truth that endures." The words, Hargrove's, hung in the air, their simplicity cutting through the studio's noise. she continued, sharing a policy insight he'd taught her, a nuanced take on immigration that balanced compassion with pragmatism. The room fell silent, the audience caught in the weight of her words, their earlier mockery forgotten. Even the man in the front row who'd shouted earlier shifted uncomfortably, his cap pulled lower. In the wings, Maya, the intern, stood wide-eyed, her coffee tray forgotten in her hands. She'd heard of Hargrove, her parents had admired him, their small-town values shaped by his speeches. She glanced at the producer beside her, who was frowning, his earpiece buzzing with instructions. Karoline's voice carried on, steady and clear, recounting a moment when Hargrove had guided her through a local debate, teaching her to listen before speaking. The audience was split now, some nodded, others whispered, phones discreetly recording. Jimmy's grin had faded, his fingers tapping the desk, a tell of unease. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but Karoline pressed on, her voice unwavering. "That's why I wrote that tweet," she said, circling back to his earlier jab. "Not to defend blindly, but to start a conversation. Hargrove taught me that. The moment hung, fragile but powerful, like a flame catching in dry grass." Jimmy tried to pivot, tossing out a lighter question about her daily routine. But the energy had shifted. The audience wasn't his anymore. Some clapped softly, a tentative show of respect, while others sat back, processing. Maya's eyes stayed on Karoline, her expression a mix of awe and resolve. The producer muttered something about time, signaling the next break, but Karoline's words lingered, their truth too heavy to dismiss. She closed the journal, her hands steady, but her heart raced. She'd opened a door, one she couldn't close now. Jimmy's smile was gone, replaced by a tight nod. What else was in that journal, and who else knew its secrets? The sunset stage hummed with a fractured energy. The audience caught in a tug-of-war of reactions as the lights burned bright overhead. Karoline Leavitt sat poised, the leather journal closed on the chair beside her, its secrets partially unveiled. Her revelation about Senator Hargrove had shifted the room. Some clapped softly, their faces softened by her words, while others murmured doubts, their arms crossed, unconvinced. The gold cross necklace at her throat glinted faintly, a quiet reminder of the faith that anchored her. Her heart still raced from the last segment, from Jimmy Kimmel's biting questions and the crowd's laughter, but she felt a spark now, a flicker of hope. She'd opened a crack in their skepticism, and it was enough to keep her steady. The air was thick with anticipation, the audience waiting to see who would claim this moment, her or the man behind the desk. Jimmy, sensing control slipping, leaned forward, his smile tight, almost forced. "Look, Karoline," he said, his voice carrying a practiced charm. "It's a nice story, but come on, Hargrove's protege, that's a stretch." He glanced at the audience, inviting them to share his disbelief. And a few laughed, their chuckles sharp but hesitant. The accusation stung, a jab at the bond she'd cherished since she was a teenager, when Hargrove had seen her potential in a small-town debate club. Karoline's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Not yet. She'd learned from Hargrove that truth didn't need to shout, it needed to stand. Her fingers brushed the journal's cover, its weight a reminder of the promises she'd made to herself, to him. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some nodding at Jimmy's words, others glancing at Karoline, searching for a crack in her composure. Then, a voice broke through from the back of the studio, clear and steady, cutting through the noise like a bell. "She's telling the truth." The audience turned, heads craning, as a woman stood, her silver hair catching the light. It was Ellen Hargrove, the senator's widow, her presence unexpected but commanding. She held a folded letter, its edges worn, and her eyes sharp with conviction, locked on Jimmy. My husband wrote this about Karoline, she said, her voice carrying the weight of years. He saw her potential when she was just a girl. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and phones flashed, capturing the moment. Karoline's breath caught, her eyes glistening as she met Ellen's gaze. She hadn't known Ellen was here, hadn't even known she was watching. The room erupted, a mix of cheers and stunned whispers, as Ellen walked toward the stage. The letter held like a torch. Jimmy's face froze, his grin replaced by a flicker of panic. He stammered, trying to pivot. "Well, that's quite a surprise," he said, his laugh hollow. But the audience wasn't his anymore. Karoline stood, her movements slow and deliberate, and took the letter from Ellen's outstretched hand. Their fingers brushed, and Ellen's eyes softened, a silent acknowledgement of shared loss and pride. Karoline's voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but it was steady enough to carry. "Senator Hargrove taught me to listen, to think, to speak for what's right," she said, her words simple but heavy. "That's why I'm here, not to defend blindly, but to honor what he believed in." She unfolded the letter, reading a line aloud. "Karoline Leavitt will change the world, not with noise, but with truth." The words landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through the room, in the wings. Maya, the intern, set down her coffee tray, her hands shaking with excitement. She clapped, her cheers joining the growing swell from the audience. Her face was alight, as if Karoline's courage had unlocked something in her. The producer beside her frowned, his earpiece buzzing, but Maya didn't care. She'd seen enough guests crumble under Jimmy's wit. But Karoline was different. The audience was split no longer. Most were on their feet, phones recording, social media already lighting up with clips of Ellen's reveal. Hashtags bloomed online: Karoline Leavitt, Hargrove Legacy. Jimmy tried to steer the conversation, asking a lighter question about Karoline's daily routine, but his voice was drowned out by the crowd's energy. The room had shifted, and Karoline stood at its center, not just a press secretary, but a legacy. She held the letter close, her eyes glistening but her posture firm. The weight of the moment pressed against her, the validation, the memory of Hargrove, the unexpected ally in Ellen. But she wasn't done. The journal still held more, and the phone in her pocket, silent since its earlier buzz, felt heavy with possibility. Jimmy's stammering faded as the producer signaled the next break, but the crowd's cheers lingered, a wave of support she hadn't expected. Maya's eyes met hers from the wings, a nod of solidarity. Karoline's heart swelled, but she knew this wasn't the end. The truth was out, but it wasn't finished speaking. What would she say next? The sunset stage pulsed with a raw, electric tension, the air thick with the aftershocks of Ellen Hargrove's revelation. Karoline Leavitt stood at the heart of it, the leather journal now open in her hands, its pages a testament to the mentor who'd shaped her. The audience was no longer a faceless mass. Some faces glowed with admiration. Others sat stunned, their earlier skepticism unraveling. The gold cross necklace at her throat caught the stage lights, a quiet beacon of her resolve. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with the weight of this moment. Jimmy Kimmel's ambush had backfired, and Ellen's letter had turned the tide, but Karoline knew the fight wasn't over. She'd bared a piece of her truth, and the room was hers now. But truth, as Senator Hargrove had taught her, wasn't just a shield, it was a sword, and she had to wield it carefully. Jimmy, visibly flustered, shifted in his seat, his usual charm fraying at the edges. His grin was gone, replaced by a tight smile as he tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Okay, Karoline, that's quite a story," he said, his voice strained, forcing a laugh. "Let's talk about something lighter, your first day at the White House." Maybe the audience stirred, some chuckling, but the sound was hollow. lacking the bite of earlier. They weren't his anymore. Karoline didn't let him pivot. She stepped forward, her voice steady, cutting through his attempt to dilute the moment. "I'd rather tell you why I'm really here," she said, her words clear, like a bell ringing in a quiet room. The audience leaned in, phones still raised, recording every second. Jimmy's eyes flickered with unease, but he nodded, trapped by the room's energy. She opened the journal, her fingers tracing a page she'd read countless times. "When I was 19, she began, her voice soft but unwavering. I watched Senator Hargrove face a reporter who'd twisted his words to fit a headline. The man was shouting, demanding answers. But Hargrove didn't raise his voice. He laid out facts, dates, numbers, letters until the reporter had nothing left to say." She paused, letting the story settle, her eyes sweeping the audience. "That's why I'm here. Not to fight, not to shout, but to end the lies." The words landed like a vow, and the room fell silent, moved by her conviction. Even the man in the front row who'd jeered earlier sat still, his cap clutched in his hands. Karoline's heart swelled not with triumph, but with the clarity of purpose Hargrove had instilled in her. In the wings, Maya, the intern, couldn't stay still. Her coffee tray had long been abandoned, and her hands trembled with a mix of awe and urgency. She stepped forward, whispering to the producer beside her, her voice low but insistent. "I posted a clip of her speech online," she said, showing him her phone. The producer's eyes widened as he saw the numbers, thousands of views in minutes, retweets spreading like wildfire. He nodded, his earpiece buzzing with instructions, but Maya's focus was on Karoline. She'd seen guests crumble under Jimmy's wit, but Karoline was different. She wasn't just fighting back. She was redefining the fight. The clip, a 30-second snippet of Karoline's Hargrove story, was captioned, "This is what courage looks like." It was going viral, and Maya's heart raced, knowing she'd helped light the spark. On stage, Jimmy's confidence was crumbling. He glanced at the monitor, where a tweet from a major news outlet flashed Leavitt School's Kimmel. The crowd caught sight of it, and a chant began. Soft at first, then louder Karoline's name, rising like a tide. Jimmy's producer signaled from the wings, a frantic wave to wrap up, but the audience was beyond control, their cheers drowning out the cue. Karoline stood tall, the journal still in her hands, her eyes meeting Jimmy's. He tried to speak, to reclaim the narrative, but his words faltered, lost in the swell of support. For the first time, he looked small, a man who'd misjudged his opponent. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The truth was out, and it was louder than any shout she could have given. She closed the journal, her fingers lingering on its cover, and took a breath. The crowd's chants washed over her, a wave of validation she hadn't expected. But beneath it, a question lingered. She could stop now, let the moment carry her, and walk away with the crowd's respect. Or she could push further, share more of the journal's secrets and risk everything. Hargrove's words echoed in her mind. Truth doesn't just win, it heals. Her phone, silent in her pocket, felt heavy again, a reminder of the message she hadn't checked. Someone was watching, someone who knew her story. The producer signaled the final moments of the segment, but Karoline's gaze stayed steady. She'd come this far. What was the next step? The sunset stage had grown quiet, the roar of the audience fading as the house lights dimmed and the cameras powered down. Karoline Leavitt stood alone near the edge of the set, the leather journal clutched to her chest, its worn cover warm against her fingers. The air felt lighter now, as if the storm of Jimmy Kimmel's ambush had finally broken, leaving a fragile calm in its wake. Her gold cross necklace glinted faintly, a steadying presence amid the whirlwind of the night. The crowd's chants still echoed in her ears, their support a tide that had carried her through the chaos. But beneath the triumph, a deeper emotion stirred grief, gratitude, and the weight of a legacy she'd fought to honor. She'd bared her truth, not just to the audience, but to herself, and the cost was etched in the tightness of her throat, the ache behind her eyes. The stage crew bustled around her, coiling cables and clearing props. But Karoline lingered, reluctant to leave the space where everything had changed. Her mind replayed the moments: Jimmy's faltering smile, Ellen Hargrove's letter, Maya's viral clip. The journal, heavy with Senator Hargrove's words, had been her anchor. But it was more than that now. It was proof of who she was, not just a press secretary, but a woman shaped by a man who'd believed in her when no one else had. She opened it, her fingers trembling, and traced a line she hadn't shared on stage. Courage isn't in the victory, but in the stand. Her breath hitched, a tear threatening to fall. She'd stood tonight, not for applause, but for him. A soft step broke her thoughts, and she looked up to see Ellen Hargrove approaching, her silver hair catching the faint stage lights. Ellen's eyes were soft, crinkled with a warmth that felt like home. "He'd be proud of you." "Karoline," she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. She held out a small object, a pin, a replica of the one Senator Hargrove had worn. A simple silver circle with a star at its center. "He gave this to me when we married," Ellen said. "I want you to have it." Karoline's composure cracked, a tear slipping down her cheek as she took the pin, its metal cool against her palm. She pinned it to her blazer, her fingers shaking, and whispered, "Thank you." The gesture was more than a gift, it was a bridge to the man who'd shaped her. A connection she thought she'd lost. Before she could say more, Maya appeared, her steps bold now, no longer the hesitant intern from the green room. Her dark hair was loose, her name tag gone, as if she'd shed her role in the studio's hierarchy. "I posted the clip," Maya said, her voice a mix of pride and confession. "I had to. People needed to see the real you." Karoline's eyes widened, a rush of gratitude flooding her. She'd noticed Maya's quiet support all night, but this was courage, a risk taken for a stranger. "You didn't have to do that," Karoline said, her voice soft. Maya shrugged, a small smile breaking through. "Yeah, I did. You reminded me of my mom. She never backed down either." The three women stood together, a quiet bond forming in the shadow of the stage, forged by truth and the shared weight of standing up. Outside, the world was waking to Karoline's story. Her phone, still in her pocket, buzzed faintly, but she ignored it, too caught in the moment. Online, the clip Maya posted had exploded, shared by thousands, with comments praising Karoline's grace under fire. A news anchor's tweet flashed across social media: "Karoline Leavitt redefines courage on Kimmel's stage." The studio's monitors, still on, showed a live feed of a reporter outside, crediting Karoline for sparking a conversation about truth in public life. But here, in this quiet corner, none of that noise mattered. Karoline looked at Ellen and Maya, her heart full. "This wasn't about winning," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was about honoring him." Ellen nodded, her hand resting briefly on Karoline's arm, a gesture that felt like absolution. The weight she'd carried, the doubt, the fear of being seen as less, began to lift, replaced by a warmth that spread through her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. Ellen's pin, Maya's courage, the audience's chants, they were proof that truth could still matter. But as the crew signaled the studio's closing, A new question settled in her mind. The world was watching now, their eyes on her next move. She'd honored Hargrove, but what did this moment mean for her future? The journal, still in her hands, held more stories, more truths. Would she share them, and who was behind the messages she hadn't yet checked? The late afternoon sun bathed Griffith Park in a golden haze, its paths winding through eucalyptus trees and patches of dry grass. Karoline Leavitt walked slowly, her navy coat unbuttoned, the silver pin Ellen Hargrove had given her glinting on the lapel. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of earth and distant traffic. A quiet contrast to the chaos of the Sunset Stage just days ago. Her leather journal rested in her bag, its weight familiar, comforting, like an old friend who'd seen her through the storm. The gold cross necklace at her throat caught the light, a steady reminder of the faith that had carried her. Her heart felt lighter now. The raw edges of that night, Jimmy Kimmel's ambush, the audience's jeers, the weight of proving herself softened by the unexpected allies she'd found in Ellen and Maya. But a quiet ache lingered, not of defeat, but of growth, the kind that comes from standing in a fire and walking out whole. She paused by a bench, her fingers brushing the pin, its star-shaped center cool against her skin. The memory of Ellen's words, "He'd be proud of you," warmed her. But it was Senator Hargrove's lessons that anchored her still. She'd come to Los Angeles expecting a fight, but she'd left with something more, a moment that had rippled beyond the studio, touching lives she'd never meet. Her phone, tucked in her pocket, had buzzed relentlessly since the show messages from colleagues, strangers, even a missed call from a number she didn't recognize. She hadn't checked them all. Not yet. The world's noise could wait, for now. She wanted this quiet, this chance to breathe and feel the ground beneath her feet. The journal held her story, but the pin, the necklace, the memory of that night, they were her strength. A small voice broke her thoughts. "Excuse me, are you Karoline, a girl, maybe 12? Stood a few feet away, her braided hair tied with a red ribbon, her eyes wide with recognition. Karoline smiled, nodding, and the girl stepped closer, clutching a phone. "I saw you on TV," she said, her voice earnest. "You didn't let them push you. My mom said you're brave." Karoline's heart swelled, a rush of warmth chasing away the last traces of doubt. She knelt slightly, meeting the girl's gaze. "Thank you," she said softly. "What's your name, Lila?" the girl replied, beaming. Karoline reached into her bag, pulling out a small card she'd carried since New Hampshire, printed with Hargrove's quote, "Truth doesn't whisper." She handed it to Lila. "Keep this," she said. "It's what keeps me going." Lila's eyes sparkled, and she ran off, waving, her voice echoing as she called to her mother. Karoline stood, watching her go, a quiet pride settling in her chest. The park felt alive around her joggers, families, the hum of a distant city, but she was part of something bigger now. Online. The story of that night had taken root. Jimmy Kimmel had issued a statement, posted late the next day, acknowledging he'd misread Karoline and praising her composure. The show invited her back, a gesture that felt more like damage control than sincerity. Karoline declined, her response polite but firm, choosing to focus on her work in D.C. News outlets reported a surge in applications for press internships, young women citing her stand as their inspiration. Social media still buzzed with clips of her speech. Maya's video now viewed millions of times, captioned with words like courage and truth. The man in the front row who'd shouted at her had even posted an apology admitting he'd judged too quickly. She walked on, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the path. The world had shifted, just a little, because she dared to speak. But it wasn't about the headlines or the viral clips. It was about Lila, about Maya, about the quiet moments that carried the most weight. She boarded a plane back to DOC that evening, the pin still on her coat, the journal open in her lap. She wrote, her pen moving slowly sometimes. The loudest truths are the ones spoken softly. The words felt like a promise, not just to Hargrove, but to herself. The story of that night was fading from the news, but its impact lingered, a reminder that courage doesn't shout. It stands firm. As the plane climbed, she looked out at the fading light, wondering what truths she'd carry next. Karoline's pin caught the fading sunlight as she boarded the plane, a small star against the dusk. The world moved on, but something lingered, a quiet shift, like a tide turning. Did courage always need a stage, or just a heart that refused to bend? Sometimes the loudest truths are the ones spoken softly, leaving echoes that reshape the world in ways no one sees coming.